Good evening. My name is Young Hong from Cooper University Hospital, and on behalf of my co-moderators for tonight's discussion, Drs. Naomi Sell at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Dr. John McCullough from Montefiore Hospital, we welcome everyone to tonight's SSAT Resident and Fellows Education Committee-sponsored webinar on financial strategies for success, light at the end of the tunnel.
And so we're honored and excited about tonight's panel of prestigious surgeons who are here to give us some insight on a topic of not commonly taught in medical school. And often we're a little too busy in surgical training to really dive into it, probably in much detail. So it's great to be here a little bit more tonight. And so our panelists are Dr. Lint Johnson from George Washington University, Dr. Benjamin Nelson from Maine Health, and Dr. Charles Scroggins from the University of Louisville. And so we just ask that everyone please write your comments or questions in the chat room throughout the webinar, and we will have time at the end of the four talks to have a panel discussion in our Q&A session.
So thank you to all the panelists. And to start us off, we have Dr. Lint B. Johnson, who is a professor of surgery and executive director of Liver and Pancreas Institute for Quality at George Washington University Hospital. He received his medical training at Harvard Medical School and completed his residency at Mass General Hospital, followed by transplant and hepatobiliary surgery at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. He was a past president of the Society of Black Academic Surgeons and the chair of the finance committee for the American Association of Studies of Liver Disease, the American Surgical Association, and the Southern Surgical Association. He is a former Robert Coffey Chair of Surgery at MedStar at Georgetown University Hospital, with whom I have the honor of my residency training under prior to moving to George Washington Hospital, where he currently resides. He will deliver us a talk titled, How to Make Smart Investments as a Young Career Surgeon. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Young and Naomi, and the rest of the committee for inviting me to give this presentation. I guess I should start out by saying that, and I like this picture of the glacier, and I'll tell you why, but I should give my disclosures. First of all, I am not a financial planner, nor am I a registered investment advisor, but I have had now close to 30 years of negotiating contracts on both ends as a receiver as well as the giver. But I think more importantly to the topic tonight is that I have had several different life experiences that I think puts me in a position at least to give some primary information about financial strategies for young career surgeons. During my tenure, I've now launched 3 different transplant programs and had that interface with hospitals, medical schools, and departments. Also, along the way, went back to school and got an MBA, thinking that it would help me kind of in my leadership and management journey in surgery. But I also became passionate around corporate finance and launched a nascent biotech investment fund. And most recently was brought on by a business consulting firm here locally in Washington to help them build out their healthcare platform. They do commercial due diligence for private equity firms in that space. So that's basically my background and what I bring to the table. But the first thing I would say is that you really need to understand your value. And just as glaciers are, most of your value as a young career surgeon is hidden beneath the surface. And so when we think about a 30-year career, plus or minus, it really is that future value that you have to protect. And the evolution in how individuals are valued in surgery have evolved over the last, I would say, 2 decades. And most importantly, you may think that you have a lot of time to make decisions, but life really comes faster than you think. And so I'd like to start by talking about kind of what to look for in early job searches. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time about compensation, but I will briefly speak on that. I think that one of our other speakers is going to talk about compensation plans. But certainly in general terms, looking at salary and comparable salary structures, security, particularly job security, that is to say, how long a contract you're being offered, and the renewable clauses associated with that. And then there are some personal things that are intangible, like self-esteem and fairness that you believe that you will achieve at that institution. There also should be a flexibility around the ability to achieve your personal and professional goals and growth, particularly as a young surgeon when many individuals are thinking about family issues and other things that will take time to pursue. The job should allow you to maintain those, if you have academic, but both academic and clinical interests. And does the department or hospital have sufficient revenue and resources to support, non-revenue generating activities, which again may be important to your professional career? And lastly, do you feel like there's a investment in you and your career as you start out? I usually point to these two resources for young surgeons to know about, because this is primarily where individuals who will be making offers to you will get their information. The MGMA, which is a group of surgical administrators across, well, not surgical, but medical administrators across the country. There is a section of surgery within it. And then the AAMC for academic programs is also another resource. And these, both of these are published on an annual basis. And so you should have some familiarity based upon your specialty and based upon where you are in the country, as well as how, where you are in your career as to what your fair compensation should be benchmarked against others across the country or region. The typical structure, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I will say that it is typical as a beginning surgeon to have a startup package, which would include a base salary. Oftentimes, you can negotiate a signing bonus, moving expenses, and if there is a research interest and research background, you may be able to get some research seed funding as well as a part of your startup package. And over time, most of that compensation will be morphed into a practice plan, which I will say pretty much universally now has some RVU-based productivity associated with it. And I'll leave it at that because I think that we'll have other discussions around compensation plans around the country. But oftentimes your clinical effort is represented as a portion of what you're bringing to the table. There may be an administrative component, which early on may be very small, but as you grow in your profession, a bigger part of your FTE will be administrative. And then there are also other components such as teaching, citizenship, and quality metrics, which may be added as a part of your FTE. So I always say that the biggest investment that you should think about is you. You really, surgeons, I think, are like professional athletes in that their peak earnings are really recognized in their second, third, or fourth contract. And the issue is really trying to protect those future earnings. None of us wants to think about, our demise, but I think one of the things that can be very tragic is for young surgeons, particularly young surgeons with families that have some sort of tragedy early on and lose their life, and they haven't thought about the fact that to protect those future earnings. And so just as an example, in terms of the type of things you think about when you have a family is certainly most of us will buy a house and have a mortgage associated with that. The estimated cost of raising a kid in the United States to age 17 right now is about $310,000. That does not include private school tuition. Depending on where you are in the country, that private school tuition can be anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000 a year. So if you do 12 years of private school education, that comes out to about, on average, about $420,000 per kid. The cost of attendance for college, whether it be public or private, obviously is different, but that can vary anywhere from 120 to about 300,000 for the cost of attendance to school. And this is just education. This is not about feeding them. It's not about joining sports. It's not about other activities. It's not about vacations. But ultimately, you can round it up. It's about $1 million per kid is the cost of raising that child to the point where they can be semi-independent. And so the importance of that is a couple of things. Again, is protecting those future earnings, because as a surgeon, you're going to be compensated relatively very well compared to other businesses in the country, but most of that compensation is going to come in the mid to end of your career as opposed to the beginning of your career. And so simple things like creating a budget. And the first thing really you should aim to do in your career is to try to eliminate debt. Many of us will come out of medical school with student loans, some of which have been deferred during our residencies, and coming up with a budget so that we can eliminate debt and start to accumulate some wealth is an important part of your professional career. I have down here a supplemental term life insurance. And this is one of the things I think is most important for a young surgeon, particularly a young surgeon who has a family or who thinks they may have a family, because we all generally will have some life insurance as a part of our benefits, but typically that life insurance is based upon a multiple of our salaries, and that within itself is not going to be enough to cover all of those life needed scenarios if something happens to us at a young age. When I put down here age limit, because oftentimes you can get a term life insurance policy that only covers you up to a certain age, whether that be 65, 70, or 75. Generally speaking, at that point, you really won't need the life insurance at that stage, because generally you will have already kind of gotten through the mortgage, putting the kids through college, and all of the other things that that you would need to do as a young surgeon down the future. The other thing that needs to be done is really take advantage of the full range of retirement accounts. And those are offered in several different forms. Each business entity will have different retirement accounts, but the more common ones are a 401k, a 403, or 457. And obviously there are limits to how much you can put in there, but maximizing that, particularly at an early age, is extremely important for this magical financial term called compounding, which basically means that as time goes along, the money that is invested and the proceeds from that investment then generates on a compounding basis to really exponentially grow your account. The other important type of insurance to have and have enough of is short and long-term disability, particularly long-term disability. Death can be one consequence of a major tragedy, but disability can be another consequence. And so recognizing the necessity for having adequate long-term disability is also very important. So just as an example, I in terms of what you might expect or what you might decide you might want to need in terms of life insurance. If you're, say, example, a minimally invasive surgeon coming right out of training, you have a family, you have 2 kids, and just suppose you have an annual salary starting out at $300,000, your spouse is not working. And suppose you buy a $500,000 home, which has a $425,000 mortgage. The first thing that you should recognize is that that $425,000 mortgage is actually going to cost you $750,000 when you add in interest that you're going to pay along with the principal. We've already talked about the cost of raising kids. So you have 2 kids and a spouse. That's about $3 million. And so the coverage that you need if you prematurely die is going to be about $4 million to cover the raising of your kids and the paying off of your home. And when you think about what is offered through the benefits plan as a multiple of your $300,000 salary, whether that be 1, 2, 3, or 4 times, that still doesn't get you to the $4 million in coverage that you really need. So one of the things I think is extremely important to consider is a supplemental term life insurance, which is really very inexpensive, particularly for younger individuals. Retirement accounts, again, each entity will have their own account, but certainly one of the more popular ones are 401ks. The federal government does limit your contributions to about to $20,500 as of 2022. If you're older, 50 or up, you can have these add-on catch-up years where you can add an additional $6,500 to come up to $27,000 a year. But certainly maximizing the your 401ks is an important investment strategy as you start your career. And this slide just shows you that the financial planners will tell you that typically you will want about 12 times your salary in savings of your ending salary at savings at age 65. And this just shows you the difference that if you start saving at various ages in various amounts of your salary, what it gets you to. And so if you start at saving at age 30 and you contribute 15% of your salary every year to a retirement account, then that will get you at age 65 about 11 times your ending salary. Now, 15% for someone who makes 300,000 again is more than 20,500 that the federal government allows, and therefore additional savings in a tax-bearing account is something that individuals should consider. There are multiple businesses that will open accounts for you, and the allocation in those accounts are typically something that you determine. As a young person, typically more of that allocation will go into stocks as opposed to bonds that are paying you a dividend every year. But as you mature through your career, that percentage of the revenue producing bonds may increase. And so these tax-bearing investments could be mutual funds, which are pool capital, generally invested in the market or some combination of stocks and bonds and or other types of businesses. You can have individual investment accounts, and unless you're going to spend a lot of time over your finances and studying companies and learning about financial spreadsheets, certainly one of the most convenient ways to open accounts in the stock market now is through what's called ETFs, which is a variation of a mutual fund. And they have them in various areas. They're a conglomeration of different stocks. They can be very broad-based. They can be very vertical in the sense that they can represent certain business entities. But typically there are low cost and over time have done as well as individual stock picking. And so that's thought to be a good place to start if you don't have the time to do all of the research necessary to stay abreast. And then lastly, there are some very more risky investments, including things like venture capital. Venture capital is investing in startups. Basically, as those companies mature, you become an equity owner within that company. And then there are alternative investment strategies as well that you can get involved in. In order to do so, you have to be what's called a qualified investor that the federal government, again, regulates. It has to do either with how much you have in liquid assets or having a salary over, I think it's about $250,000 for 2 years, makes you a qualified investor. So those are all different kind of investing avenues. And so lastly, the generation you guys are in is different than when I grew up, but what about you only live once, and why not, you have to enjoy yourself. And I think that you can enjoy yourself, but one of the parts of enjoying yourself is understanding that if you have some financial plan for your future, it's much easier to enjoy, the present. And so just to summarize, making a budget, getting rid of eliminating debt, building an emergency fund in the sense that if something happens to you, that you'll have anywhere from 3 to 6 months of your salary saved up, maxing out on your retirement accounts, making those savings automatic, and then becoming educated on the various investment options, I think are all critical parts of starting out in an investment strategy. So I think I'll stop here and then be available to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. That was fantastic. And yes, we'll kind of do a nice full Q&A at the end here, but that was incredibly helpful. And so next we have Dr. Benjamin Nelson. And so he's a general surgeon at Waldo County General Hospital, part of Maine Health up in Belfast, Maine. And so he received his medical training at Boston University School of Medicine, and that's prior to completing his residency at Boston Medical Center. And so he'll be delivering our next talk on the financial impact of gender disparity in surgery.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see that? Perfect. All right, so yes, I'm Ben Nelson. I'm a general surgeon up in Belfast, Maine. I've been in practice for about a year now. And I'm going to be talking today about the financial impact of gender disparity in surgery. So I also want to disclose that I have no formal financial training. I've been doing my own investments in finance since I was about 15 when my dad had me open my first Roth. But other than selling life insurance for Northwestern Mutual for a week in college, I have no other formal financial training. I've just given a series of talks about finance for physicians throughout the country. So I guess the first question we have to clarify is there a gender difference in surgeon pay? And the answer is a resounding yes. And this is well documented both in the medical literature and in the lay press. So then an obvious follow-up question would be, how bad is it? And it's really bad is the answer. The numbers vary, but it's estimated, overall physicians, female physicians earn about $2 million less than male physicians over the course of a 40-year career. I think this is probably an underestimation for various reasons. One, higher paying specialties such as surgery tend to have higher or larger differences in gender disparity in their pay. We know that specialties that were once male dominated have become more female dominated, have seen declines in average salaries. And a lot of these estimates don't take into account compounding interest and potential value of this salary invested over the course of a career. There's an article from earlier this year from JAMA, from the AAMC data. They estimated that the median difference in surgeon salary based on gender was about $64,000 as a starting salary. This grows over the course of a career. And so by mid-career, about 10 years in, that difference was about $100,000. So let's run the numbers. And if you take that $64,000 and save it and invest it for 30 years, you will have contributed about $2 million in cash in differences there based on gender. Now we know that bonds in general return about 5% a year, stocks in general return about 10% a year historically. And so let's say you have a nice mix, you invested that money moderately. And so over a 30-year career, that difference actually turns out to be about $6 million. And so now if at 10 years you switch to $100,000, which is what the data shows, just in cash savings, that difference is close to 3 million, and the investment value is now north of $7 million. So this is obviously a huge problem, and one that I'm going to have to explain to my daughter as she gets older, if we haven't solved it by then. But the question then is, why is this happening? And I think the answer is obviously multifactorial, like everything. I think implicit bias plays a huge role. And the data backs that up. There was another JAMA article talking about gender disparity in general surgery residency program awards. And it's proven that men tend to get more awards in general surgery residency programs than women. So I think this gender discrimination starts early. That same article we were talking about earlier that we got the $64,000 number from looked at whether or not this difference in gender salaries was based on the starting salary or differences in growth over the career. And what they found was really the main difference was the initial starting salary. Men's salaries tended to grow a little bit faster. They were mainly a percentage. And so a percentage of a higher number is a higher number. And that's why they tended to grow a little bit faster. But really, it's the starting salary that sort of sets the tone. And then there was a very interesting article out of Canada. Canada has a fee-for-service model. It's a little bit different than our RVU model, but the principle is the same. Different procedures are billed at different amounts based on complexity, et cetera, similar to our RVU system. It's not perfect, obviously. But they assumed that, if men and women surgeons were operating and doing similar type procedures, their hourly earnings in the operating room should be similar. But they found that they weren't. Men made more money per hour than women in the operating room. And what they found was that men tended to do procedures that were billed for more money than women did. And so they thought, could this be a gender, like a surgeon preference mix, whereas men they thought that's unlikely. More likely, they think there's some implicit bias in the referral pattern. That was their conclusion. The referral patterns tended to favor giving the more complex, higher paying procedures to the men than to the female surgeons. Additionally, there are gender differences in perception of value. And so this was a study, a survey study, I think from 19 or so different residencies. They asked general surgery residents, both male and female, what they expected their minimum and ideal salaries to be starting. And what they found is that men expected their salaries to be higher than women expected their salaries to be, both minimum and ideal, and this difference was significant. They also asked about attitudes towards negotiation. Men tended to more often believe that they have tools to negotiate an appropriate salary successfully. Men tended to believe more that negotiating was appealing to them. And men were more likely than women to seek out other job offers to help them negotiate a higher salary. So then the question is, how can we fix this problem? And I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. The Association of Women Surgeons has released a statement on gender equity, and I think it's very apt. You can read through this, but I'll make some highlights here. Identifying policies, procedures, and leadership that promote equity in surgery, obviously, in salaries, that promote transparency in salary and what criteria are used to give different salaries, establishing programs that empower women to understand their worth and negotiate appropriately. And this should start early in medical school and residency. Providing implicit bias training, ensuring routine reassessments of departments and practices on gender equity, and then non-departmental oversight of compensation models. And so if you look at these, 5 out of those 6 are going to take a lot of time, a lot of bureaucracy. I think, they are great, and we have to push for these things from an institutional perspective. But in terms of concrete things that you can take away from this talk today, I think number 3 is the biggest. Establishing programs that empower women to understand their worth and negotiate appropriately. And these should start with medical students and residents. And so what is this really? This is financial literacy, right? So understanding what you're worth, looking at that data, knowing what surgeons in your area are making and your type of practice in your region of the country, so that you can go in educated to your first contract. Learning how to negotiate. If you're still in residency, talk to your program director about including some financial education, negotiation education in your didactics, I think is really, really important. Or getting a book and reading on your own and just, empowering yourself to learn about this. For me, I used a contract lawyer when I got my first contract. This was someone who was on retainer through the Maine Medical Association for a flat fee of $300. He looked at both my contract and my wife's contract, and he was able to tell us whether our salaries were commensurate with other, surgeons and physicians in the region, other hospital systems in the region, whether we were on the lower, medium, or high end, whether our contracts were standard, if there was anything to worry about in terms of non-compete clauses, that kind of thing. It was really, really helpful. And if nothing else, it gives you peace of mind. And so I think that's really important to do as well. And then don't discount other things when you're negotiating your contract. Things like the referral patterns in the area, who's doing what cases, when are your clinic days, when are your block times, when are the meetings. Something that happened to me when I got my contract is once I started working my block time, one of my operating days was Thursday. It just happens that the staff meeting is on Thursday mornings once a month. And so once a month, instead of starting at 7:30, I have to start my cases at 9. But the end time's the same. And so I'm less productive than my colleagues and my partners who can start at 7:30 every week, every day. And so that sort of implicit bias can be used to lower your salary or force you to generate fewer RVUs, even though you're trying to do the same job. And then, using all of this to really close that wage gap with your first contract, I think can from on an individual level, help us to narrow the gender wage gap that we see. So I know this is, a fairly large topic, and I tried to succinctly summarize it because we only have like 10, 15 minutes here. But as a summary, there is a significant gender wage gap in the medical field, and this can cost women several $1 million throughout their careers, both in salary and in lost compounding interest. The reasons obviously multifactorial. We talked about implicit bias and an underestimation of your self-worth and negotiation skills. And fixing this injustice is going to take time and effort from both institutions and individuals. But I think promoting equity, promoting transparency, and then empowering each other with tools to increase our own financial literacy is really, really important. And I hope this wasn't too much like mansplaining, but I have a 3-year-old daughter, and I have tried to teach her the value of money starting at an early age. She has a food shack that she sets up, and we discuss money and transactions and negotiation. And, I try to get her she tries to like pay me for food that she's giving me, but I'm working on it. And I think it's important to start young and really talk about finance, and it should no longer be taboo in any field and not in medicine, especially. So I'll stop there. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nelson, for such an important and critical topic as gender disparity. And I know that's a hot topic, and I know we'll touch on a lot of that more at the Q&A session. Last but not least, our last speaker for the evening is Dr. Charles Scoggins, who's a professor and vice chairman for operations and finance at the Hiram C. Polk Jr. Department of Surgery at the University of Louisville. He received his medical training at Montgomery Medical School at UT Health and has completed his residency at Vanderbilt University before completing a surgical oncology fellowship at the MD Anderson Cancer Center. He received his MBA at the University of Louisville School of Medicine, in addition to being a black belt in judo and a brown belt second strike in jiu-jitsu. He is well accomplished in his career and his finance, and he will deliver talk financial compensation models for surgeons, art of negotiation. Dr. Scoggins, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for that. Ben, if I could get you to close out your screen share so I can share mine. Thank you, man. Appreciate it. I want to get some of those sprinkles. That looked pretty good on that menu there. So does that look okay? Can you see those
We
slides?
just see the background of your wallpaper.
Let's see, it says here, I'm sharing the screen, and let me try it again.
Still your background wallpaper.
Is it better?
No, we still see your wallpaper only.
Okay. Well, let's see, what am I doing wrong? It worked a minute ago when we tried it. Screen share. Any thoughts, Young?
Are you on a double screen by chance?
I don't think, no.
Can you try to maximize and minimize the PowerPoint and see if that?
Well, we tried it out in the
Yeah.
session and it worked just fine.
Bevel, do you have his slides by chance that you can?
No,
No.
shouldn't have them because I worked on them earlier today.
Let's see.
Maybe send it to her by email. Is
Yeah,
that possible?
Yeah, we have a lot of time.
When it allows you to hit share screen and there's maybe a couple options, is there one that allows you to click right on the PowerPoint itself?
Yeah, it says Microsoft. I don't know why it's doing this. Because we tested it out just a little while ago and it worked great. So somebody tell jokes while I'm working on this.
It's probably one of the chairs that don't want you to share that information.
It's Kelly McMaster's who sabotaged me yet again.
Well, we did say that we were going to briefly touch on the fourth topic that we were not able to do, which was innovation. And if any medical students or residents or fellows or young faculty has a new innovation, what are some tips for protecting your patent and making, because I know that a lot of times when you sign a contract, any patents or innovation is the property of the hospital which you are employed to. So what are some tips for or advice if you have a cool innovation that you think you're going to just have something that's going to take off? Like, what are your negotiation tactics, if any?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. Typically, if you're doing it in a university-based lab, that is the work that you're doing is in a university-based lab, there usually is a requirement that you go through the university IP office, and most of the if it's going to be patented, most of the ownership does go to the institution, but there generally is some compensation in the form of royalties if it becomes realized, that would come back to the to the inventor. So for example, when I was in the lab at the Children's Hospital in Boston, ironically, I worked with a young man who's now a billionaire named Bob Langer, who was a polymer chemist at MIT. And my project was on placing hepatocytes on erodible biopolymer matrices. We patented it. And then it became a part of a family of patents. And periodically I would receive a small quote unquote royalty check from MIT, which is the organization through which the lab was based. And then several years later, I got a call from one of the patent attorneys saying that now the lab had many patents and they wanted to consolidate them. So since I was only on one patent, they told me that they wanted me to come off that patent so that they can consolidate the others. And at that point, I consulted a friend of mine who was an attorney, and he came up with a different solution, which was that they could just add me to all of the other families and then be done with it. But they weren't willing to do that, and we stayed on the patent, and it has its course and it goes away. But I think depending on how much ownership you have in the invention, there are opportunities to negotiate with the institution, but generally that's going to require you having some, I would say, professional support in the sense of a patent attorney to help you come out on the best end of that negotiation. Just as a piece of information, Bob Langer went on to develop and is responsible for the lipid nanoparticles that are used in the COVID vaccines, amongst other. He's got about 300 biotech companies that he or his disciples have launched now. Through Moderna, he's now doesn't really need to work on projects anymore.
Oh my goodness.
Brilliant guy, though.
Let's see. We're still trying to get the last talk on. Any thoughts on any pitfalls that you've seen in your young faculty that you've seen come through, or bad negotiations where they didn't negotiate well enough? What are some common pitfalls that you've seen over the years for people coming up to you for negotiating from you, or some faculty that you've seen just kind of make poor life decisions or poor choices, and what can we learn from those?
That's a very good question. Of course, I would think that I've been fair with everyone that I've negotiated a contract with. So, but I think in terms of when I think about the things that I remember most is individuals at very young ages. One of whom was a resident mate of mine who developed MS during the residency. And again, this kind of makes me harp on those things to protect your future earnings. And then another young man who really mirrored his career after mine, who tragically was killed in a car accident while as a fellow. And at the time, his wife was pregnant. And so to me, the things that I mentioned in my earlier talk in regards to investing in early on and trying to protect those future earnings in vehicles are the things that I think that I've seen that have been most tragic and most poignant in my memory in terms of things that could have been handled a lot better. Looks like Dr. Scoggins has his slides.
Yeah, so between I was hacked by the Russians. So between our test session, which happened at 4:50, and now somehow my computer didn't allow me to share my screen. So I apologize for that. It's like my first day on a Zoom meeting. It's not like we've been doing this for 3 years. So thank you to the committee for inviting me to present. I'm going to talk a little bit about financial compensation models. Some of that's already been covered, and I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'll go kind of quickly, and a few things on how to launch a successful career. And like everybody, I have no disclosures, and I don't claim to be an expert in anything. So my objectives today is really to talk about how doctors work and how they get paid. I didn't understand this. I didn't understand this as a junior faculty member. And I had to get an MBA at night and think about this and work on it to figure this stuff out. I want to talk to you a little bit how you add value to the hospital and health system, and then finally a few strategies for launching a successful career, since this is what the group is getting ready to do. And you got to start this off by talking about the big elephant in the room, which it's okay to make a living. It's okay to get paid for what you do. You know, a lot of people say, well, you're doctors, you're altruistic, you shouldn't be worried about money. And it's true, you shouldn't think that all the time, but it's a great thing we do, and we get paid well to do it. So there's several different models for physician employment. One that you can think of is the traditional private practice. You go out and practice after your residency, and you hang a shingle up, and you start your practice, or maybe you join a group of several surgeons in the true private practice model. And that seems to be diminishing a lot in our country. There's the governmental model of employment, which would be like you work for the VA or you're a military doc. Or finally, the more common is working for a health system. That might be a university or a medical school. That might be working for a community health system or even for an individual hospital. But this, by and large, is becoming more and more common across our country. And in fact, in my area in Louisville, I don't think we have any true private practice surgeons anymore. Everybody works for somebody. So if you have a model for working, you need to have a model for compensation. So there's the straight salary. We're going to pay you $100 a year to be a surgeon, or there's the most common, which is a salary plus a bonus, and that bonus usually is linked to some productivity metrics. Those might be RVUs. They might be other things like publications or serving on committees to help offset that Thursday morning late start. But usually the most common model for physician compensation that we're seeing now is a salary plus some sort of bonus based on some productivity. And then there are some models that are completely eat what you kill. It's completely productivity based, but those seem to be less common now. So how do physicians actually get paid? This took me a while to figure out, but it's really simple if you think about it. So doctors get paid by taking care of patients, and this generates units of work. They're called RVUs, or relative value units. So instead of selling televisions and turning in receipts, I sold 5 TVs today, you do some things to patients. And in our case, we do surgeries to patients, and these generate certain amounts of work based on the complexity, and those are called RVUs. And the residents and fellows have heard attendings talking about this all the time, but it's a little bit nebulous in general. So number one, you need a diagnosis. So if you're gonna take care of a patient, you got to have a diagnosis, and the ICD-10 is the current version of the codes. There's over 70,000 codes. Who could remember all that stuff? But luckily, the codes that you use, you'll kind of figure out what these are. And you folks are used to using these codes now, because that's how you log in your procedures for your procedure logs for your residency and fellowship. Here are a couple of my favorites: sucked into a jet engine. I mean, and burn due to water skis on fire, subsequent encounter. If you got that, you're probably not going to survive. So clearly the folks who wrote the ICD-10 had a sense of humor, or at least somebody did, and they stuck in some good ones. So let's pretend like our diagnosis you're seeing is acute appendicitis. And you can see there that the diagnosis code for acute appendicitis is a K35.3. You don't have to know that code, but you have to know that you're dealing with acute appendicitis, and you're having to document the diagnosis of acute appendicitis. Then we take the patient to the operating room, and we do a lap appy for that acute appendicitis. Now, this code you do need to know. It's a 44970, and that says you did a laparoscopic appendectomy. And most hospitals have a system for submitting your charges. There's some built in the various EMRs, such as Epic and Cerner and things like that. And you have to submit a CPT code that makes sense with your diagnosis code. So it would be sort of silly and it'll get kicked back if you did a lap appy of 44970 and the diagnosis was breast cancer. Now you say, well, wait a minute, I would never do that. But wait a minute, you might have a breast cancer patient you've been taking care of for several years, and that patient comes to the ER with appendicitis. But in your medical record, you've got breast cancer, and hypertension and diabetes. You got to make sure that you add the correct diagnosis. So after you do that lap appy for that patient with appendicitis, that generates a work RVU. And currently the work RVUs assigned to that CPT code of 44970 generates you 9.5 work RVUs. Now, the RVU system, when we talk about RVUs, we're usually talking about work RVUs because that's what is under our control. If I do a lap appy, it's 9.45 work RVUs. And if Dr. Nelson does a lap appy up in Maine, it's still 9.45. The health system will use something called total RVUs, which factors in geographic payment differences and costs, and it also factors in other costs like Band-Aids and electricity, et cetera. So it's actually about 0.5 times higher. So the total RVUs in Louisville, Kentucky will be slightly different than the total RVUs in Los Angeles or New York, where it's more expensive, but the work RVUs to the physician is the same. So this was touched on some by Dr. Johnson, talking about benchmarking salaries. These are the more common salary benchmarks that are used, the MGMA and the AAMC. The FMV is also used, and these are salary surveys. So you think if you have a person in your department that is your administrator, they know what the salary is of all the surgeons. They also know the rank of all the surgeons. So you got the assistant professors, associate and full professors, and they'll submit these surveys that survey data that comes out, and it generates stuff that looks like this. So this is for general surgery. These data are from 2018 because this is the survey that I had available to me. And you can see there for instructor, 20 respondents. You can see for a assistant professor, 414 respondents. So let's go down the assistant professor. So it looks like the median salary across the country in 2018 for an assistant professor in general surgery was $325,000. These are in thousands. So, but wait a minute, I'm an assistant professor. I just started last year, and I'm only making $300,000. I'm being underpaid. You got to remember that for this survey, some of these 414 assistant professors had been there 5 weeks, and some of them had been an assistant professor for 5 years. So this is the median salary for assistant professors across the time span of their being an assistant professor. So it takes a little bit of understanding. And you can see that as you progress through academic ranks, the salary tends to increase, and that should be intuitive. So if you understand how doctors get paid, we see a patient, we take care of them, we generate an RVU, we get paid a base salary plus some RVU productivity that's usually weighted on your FTE equivalent. Well, how do hospitals get paid? And it's interesting, they get paid completely differently. Hospitals get paid based on something called a DRG, or a diagnosis related group. So for appendicitis, you can see it there, it's a DRG 342. So let's say the hospital is going to get paid $100 for taking care of a patient with appendicitis. Everything the hospital does has to come out of that $100. That includes the propofol, that includes whatever antibiotic you gave them, the fluids, the nurse's salary, the rent, the electricity, and how many staple firings, et cetera. So it's pretty easy to see how the hospital is interested in different things than you are, like getting the patient out quicker, using fewer staple loads, or negotiating between Ethicon and Covidien for a better stapler contract. And maybe you like the Ethicon stapler, but the hospital decided to go with Covidien because they got a cheaper contract because they only get paid $100 for taking care of somebody with a DRG 342. You can quickly see how sometimes the hospital's payment structure and the doctor's payment structure aren't exactly aligned on the same thing, and it can get muddy pretty quickly. So there's a concept called hospital contribution margin that that few docs are privy to see these information. If you look at the end of a day, after someone does a liver transplant, the median contribution margin to the hospital, i.e. the median profit to the hospital, is about $50,000. It's pretty good. That'll fluctuate some with where the transplant's done and the severity, and also how sick the patient is and how long they're in the hospital. But on median, you can see that it's a huge contribution margin as compared to some of the other procedures. So it's easy to see pretty quickly why on the transplant service they have a liver coordinator and a kidney coordinator, and sometimes a pancreas coordinator and a outpatient coordinator. You can clearly see why the hospital is ready, willing, and able to help out some specialties and get more stuff done and give resources. Then you have to tie in something called benefit versus salary, and these are some median data. But look at CT surgery. So if the average CT surgeon they typically do quite a bit of surgeries and generate a ton of RVUs to the hospital, and their DRGs are very high. You can see the hospital revenues are typically very high for a cardiac surgeon, and they often command a high salary. General surgery still very valuable to hospitals, and on average generate really good salaries, and those are median salaries that obviously fluctuate some. But you can see that a good busy general surgeon will put somewhere north of $2 million in the hospital's pocket at the end of the year. So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about launching a career, since that's what most of you are getting ready to do. And it's hard to believe that all this hard work and studying and getting up and working 80 hours, it's going to pay off, but it actually does. And it's super exciting. And finding the right fit, finding that right job is absolutely 100% everything. It's everything. I can't stress that enough. You might be thinking you want to go into academics, or you might be thinking that's not for me, I want to go in private practice. You got to find out what fits best for you and go with it. I think that finding a mentor is probably the most important thing you can do as a new person coming out of training. And it begins really with a job interview. So when you're interviewing at a job, ask the junior faculty or the junior surgeons about what kind of mentoring they have. They may have a formal program and call it a mentoring program, or it may be informal, but they're just really good at it. If you ask the junior folks, they'll actually tell you the truth. And then you should ask your attending. So, if you're interviewing for a job at the university of wherever, you should talk to your attendings and say, hey, who's good there? Who should I talk to about being a mentor? And do you think that they would be a good person, a good fit for me? And you got to realize you're probably going to need more than one mentor. You're probably going to need a clinical mentor. You're going to need some research mentors if you're in academics. And it's always great to have a personal mentor, whether it's a pastor or a friend or even some of the other faculty. I think that you have to remember that when you first start out, your first job, you've got to be flexible. And you've got to fill a gap. They're going to hire you to do MIS surgery, but realize you might have to do some maximally invasive surgery before you build a full-time minimally invasive surgery practice. Or if you really want to do HPB and you take a surgical oncology job, you might have to do some other non-HPB stuff like breast and melanoma and lymph node biopsies and ports until you build that heavy HPB focus you're looking for. So just be flexible, and I promise it'll work out. I can't say this enough. You've got to trust the people you work with and admire your partners. You got to trust your boss. So these are the two of my bosses I've been fortunate to work with, Hiram Polk and now Kelly McMasters, and they're everything to me. Kelly has been a mentor and friend to me. I was hired. Hiram was the chair of surgery when I was hired in Louisville. and Kelly was my division chief in general surgery. I'm sorry, surgical oncology. And he said, we're going to take care of you. We're going to make everything happen the way you want it to happen. And it's happened in spades. So if you trust your boss, they'll take care of you. The ideal mindset for an assistant professor or a junior faculty member or a junior surgeon is, number one, to be flexible. And that could mean in clinical service, somebody wants you to, those referring docs are going to send you a few test cases. They're going to send you a port and like a lymph node biopsy, and they're going to call the patient's spouse after the surgery. And were they nice to you? Did they answer your questions? All those things. And those test cases are real. And if you do a good job, then they're going to start sending you good cases. You're going to have to be flexible with some hospital committees. You don't want to get over committed, and that's where having a good mentor will help out. You need to be flexible in your writing and scheduling and your research, but you also have to be dependable and fix problems. That might include things like interviewing intern candidates and medical students and giving oral exams to medical students, but you do need to be somewhat flexible and dependable on that. And finally, I think that the success looks something like this. Some of it's financial. We all want to be paid well, and we are paid well. We want to be financially set for the future. And I think Dr. Johnson talked about some strategies to invest well and make that happen. We want to be successful in our work and feel like you make a difference in people's lives and feel like you're valued in your community and in your hospital. And finally, it feels so great to have personal success, and whatever that looks like for you, having a solid relationship. If you have children, spending quality time with them and scheduling time with your kids and having a well-rounded life. Thanks for your patience with my computer who decided not to work. And I appreciate your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Scoggins. That was a great talk. And I know as a current fellow about to dive in, all three of these talks super relevant about everything kind of coming ahead here. And so one question I have really for all three of you is, I know two of you have MBAs, and then even Dr. Nelson, you chatted a bunch about kind of educating yourself on these topics. And I was wondering kind of from the three of your opinions of, as a resident, as a fellow, or in just junior faculty, what are some resources? What are the best things out there to help educate young surgeons on finances, on kind of how to invest their money, protect their savings, and things like that?
Well, I'll start. Dr. Johnson said it perfectly. Number one, get rid of your debt. Get rid of your debt. Get rid of your debt. If you've got med school loans, which most of us did, get rid of it. There are programs to help pay off student loans. If you're in academics doing research, look for those. Your mentors will help you find those. But get rid of your debt, because of just like growing your finances with compound interest, that debt also grows with compound interest. So get rid of it. Get rid of it now. Once you get rid of that debt, then you can really start to make some investments. Some people, we all should max out our retirement plans. Some states you'll have available to participate in a variety of retirement plans. And then you should think about what sort of other investment strategies you're comfortable with. So if you're comfortable with running some real estate and rental properties and things like that, then that's a one way that a lot of folks do that. Some people aren't comfortable with that, but I think that you've got to get rid of that debt first.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't think there's any one or a couple of resources to really go to. I think there's really a host of resources that you can research through the internet. My usually go to is as we as surgeons go to master surgeons to learn about surgery and the history of surgery and how they crafted their careers. I similarly think about investing in finances in the same way. And obviously there are some master investors that have published, how they view the investment landscape. And I think those are always good as primers to kind of understand as a base.
And I agree with all of that. And I would just say, I've enjoyed reading books like The White Coat Investor, I think is, sort of a classic. There's a great book called The Millionaire Next Door that was written in the 90s. It's also a great book. I use the compounding interest calculator on my phone. There's an app, you can download it to just set goals. You can say, like, if I'm able to save this much every month for this many years, what's that going to look like? Could I retire early, or could I become financially independent early? That kind of thing. And then I have a half an hour drive to work every day, so I listen to financial podcasts. There's tons of them out there, whichever one interests you the most. And then I would say just start small, and I think most investors out there, like Warren Buffett, the big ones, all agree that sort of like just putting your extra money in a low cost index fund is probably the safest and easiest thing that takes the littlest amount of effort and is the smartest thing you can do early in your career.
I have a question in response to Dr. Scoggins's talk. You kind of laid out beautifully just how the surgeon is paid and how the hospital is paid. And so what do you say about cost of surgery? One surgeon uses all the new gadgets and all the multiple staplers when you can sew and close anastomosis, and your cost of one surgery for the same case is vastly different. How do you balance that, and what incentivizes a surgeon to decrease cost in a case?
Well, one thing that would certainly incentivize a surgeon to decrease costs is if they were paid by the hospital and the hospital started factoring that in. We're not there yet, certainly not in Kentucky. But, if you got surgeon A that does a lap appy in a reasonable amount of time with reasonable results, and they use 50% of the equipment, if they use one stapler as opposed to, I don't like that stapler, 17 staple loads and 3 energy devices and all that stuff, the hospital is the one that's going to have to crack down on that.
There was a question from the chat room from Miguel that's asked, what is the average age of retirement, or what is the recommended age of retirement?
Wait, let me see what time it is. Right now.
Well, I guess I'm the most senior person on the chat here. I think that depends. It depends on where you are in with your kind of life issues. We talked a little bit about your house and mortgage. We talked about kids. I think that depending on when you started and how many kids and all of those factors has an impact on, as well as your own general health, has an impact on when you retire. I would say that it's very unusual for surgeons to continue active clinical practice past their 80s. There's certainly some who have, but I would say that most tend to retire probably somewhere between 67 and 75 years of age at this stage of the game right now. I don't know if either of you guys have a different opinion about that, but
no, that's certainly what we see. We're here at the University of Louisville, most surgeons practice into their late 60s, and we have some folks who've gone beyond that, but I think a lot of folks oftentimes will take on more of an administrative role as they decide to, surgery and using your hands on a daily basis, that's a perishable skill, right? Just like anything, and you practice, but it is a perishable skill. And I think it's very important for surgeons to recognize when their physical skills aren't as good as they used to be, and but they still have stuff to contribute, and find a different way to do that.
And so we have a couple other questions popping up in the chat here. So first question coming up from Danny is, do academic surgery jobs typically help with med school debt repayment?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, maybe Dr. Johnson would be able to write you a check to help pay. No, they don't. Unfortunately, I mean, but there are ways that you can get your debt paid off, right? So if you're in academics and doing research, then there are programs, some of which are sponsored by the NIH and others, where you can get some loan forgiveness, which can be quite substantial. And then I think that residents have lived pretty frugally because you didn't have a lot of money. And if you did a fellowship, kind of the same thing, it's just residency 2.0. So when you become a new faculty member, if you've got $100,000 in debt, maybe you don't have to live quite as frugally, but maybe live frugally for 3 or 4 years and get rid of that debt as quickly as possible. And then you can, get that beautiful home you've always dreamt of or whatever. But get rid of that debt.
And I think
No, I was going to say, the only thing I would say is that I would agree that most would not pay for your student loans, but there are opportunities, I think, to negotiate a sign-on bonus, which can be used to eliminate some of the student debt. It's usually a percent or so of your salary, not a small percent of your salary. And so that is one way. The institution that I left does have a program to try to retain their, and Young, you probably had already gone, but in order to try to retain their valued trainees in the system, they will give them some medical student loan relief. But in reality, it's in deference to not giving them a sign-on bonus. So, I think that would be the trade-off, and to think about it maybe in negotiating in those terms.
I must have missed that memo, Dr. Johnson. Must have missed
Keep in mind, though, that nobody's going to give you a sign-on bonus if you don't ask.
That is correct.
You ain't going to offer.
If I could go back in time. We have a second question. What is the value, since both of you earned your MBA degree, what is the value of an MBA degree for surgeons, and when in your career did you choose to do it?
I think that the value is, if you're interested in administration, interested in finance, it's fantastic. Some people are born with an innate sense of business. I'm not that person. So I had to get that formal training. I think you should get it done. If you're going to do it, you should get it done when you think that your practice and your life, when you have the time. So I did it at night and on weekends here at the University of Louisville. They paid for me to go to school. And so it didn't cost me anything. That was a bonus. And I had been on faculty for about 5 years. So I was still, I was kind of getting close to make that jump between assistant and associate professor. I had about a 75% or 80% mature practice at that point. So I had a little bit of extra time to do it. So for me, that was the right time.
Yeah, and I did mine similarly. I wanted to wait until my kids were at a certain age. I also did an executive program. And at that time, there weren't Zooms, but we did a lot of it by CD-ROM, which was used at that time, at our own time that we could get it done. And so I would listen to lectures at 4 a.m. in the morning. There were projects that were time dependent, and so you had to do those things at a certain time. But most of it allowed the flexibility to complete a task around your own timing and schedule, and so that worked out very well. I think the value is the fact that healthcare now represents 20% of the GDP of our country, and clearly everybody recognizes that's too much. And so understanding the verbiage, the language, which the financial language, which is almost like, what attorneys speak in legal terms and what we speak in medical terms, I think is a value if if you have an interest in finances. And so, you know, I think that's one aspect of it. Certainly, management and leadership skills are something that, you know, also are taught based upon where you go to business school. And so there are various aspects that you can kind of focus on and get various things from it. But certainly for me, I agree with Dr. Scoggins that the financial piece of it was what I found most valuable.
Mm.
And the last question comes to us from Boston. Dr. Z Fong, who's the surgical oncology fellow at the Brigham, asked, if you're comfortable with a certain surgical approach that is more costly and in the literature has demonstrated no benefit, how do you balance what you perceive as the right thing in your hands for your patient versus how it's perceived by your boss in the hospital?
I mean, I think you got to put the patient first, and you got to do what you're comfortable with, and you got to get the patient, get the procedure done, get the patient off the table as safely as you can do it. At least starting out as a young surgeon, you know, and that's what I would say. I wouldn't compromise technique to save some money. If you know how to do something some way, I would do it the safest you can do it.
Yeah, that's solid advice.
I have a kind of follow-up question in terms of that then also in that. So say you're a new surgeon trying to negotiate a contract and there are certain tools that you've trained with and maybe want to bring to a practice, but the hospital doesn't have said tools. How do you negotiate for it, or is that a possibility? I guess maybe that's part of the flexible component that we talk about of learning some new things. But is there an art to negotiating for some of the tools that maybe you've trained with and want to bring with you, and devices and things like that?
Yeah. So at least for me, the first of all, the hospital has been very receptive to whatever I asked for. I mean, no one was doing laparoscopic inguinal hernias where I am. You know, I'm at a small 25-bed critical access hospital, and no one was doing them the way I was trained. One guy does them TEP, but I was trained TAP, and so I asked for a certain mesh, and so they just gave me their Bard reps number that I was used to when I called him, and he came in and gave us, he came in and troubleshot with me and brought in all the meshes and was there in the operating room when I was doing the case, and they're real easy to text with. And then the hospital just ordered whatever I asked for. I mean, I didn't have any problems with it. I didn't receive any pushback. The hospital that I work at in particular has been very receptive. So I haven't had any issues with that. You just ask and they've gotten it. That, like certain stuff I haven't really, like the stapler that we use there is different than the one I trained with in residency, but it's a stapler, and it fires a little different, but it's no problem. But things like the 3D mesh, the concave, the things like that I couldn't really work without, they've been great about it. You just ask and get in touch with the rep, and they let me pretty much just interact with the rep one-on-one, and then they order from the rep, and it's no problem.
Yeah, and that concept can span a variety of things. So for you, it was getting some different meshes and getting the equipment together for some inguinal hernia repairs. But for a surgical oncologist coming out of training, it might be that you want to start a HIPEC program at a hospital, and which is you're going to need big, expensive machines. You're going to have chemotherapy delivered in the operating room, and the operating room nurses have no clue, and they don't want to mess with chemo, believe me. And then the hospital is going to have a complete shift in patient care because those patients eat up a ton of resources. They get a ton of perk drains and they come back in with problems, et cetera. So if you were wanting to start some new program, and I just use HIPEC as an example because it's easy to see how it could get super complicated from the hospital side, then that's something you'd have to discuss up front. And so if you were a surgical oncologist coming out and you really wanted to do HIPEC, and I want that to be discussed during the hiring process, because, oh yes, we're very interested in starting a HIPEC program. And then we would need to sit down with that person, with the candidate, to talk to them about what sort of equipment they might need. We need to see some data on hospital length of stay, et cetera, to figure out, is the hospital willing to support said program.
Well, on behalf of the SSAT Resident and Fellows Education Committee, Dr. Naomi Sell and I would like to thank you so much to the panelists tonight. It was a night of really insightful education, and I think, you know, to say that we really don't get any of this during medical school and residency and fellowship. So this really was so insightful, and we thank you so much for your time and expertise. I'm sure that the recording will be viewed for a lot of the trainees who couldn't make it on tonight, but thank you so much for your evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.